So now we're going to talk about statistics. One of the main ideas of statistics is what we actually use statistics for. One of the big reasons we use statistics is to be able to look at a really big group of people or things without really looking at the whole group of people or things. So it's important to understand this idea of a population and a sample. A population is the full big group of everybody that we want to study. So that, for instance, suppose I wanted to look at every high school student and I wanted something about them. Like I want to talk about with every single high school student, what were their favorite subjects or something along those lines. It might be really challenging to go and talk to every single high school student in the US. That number of people is just way too big. It's just unreasonable to reach out to that many. But what if I could get a small group of them and that was very representative of the whole population? That's the idea of sampling, is to say, what if I could look at, say, 100, 200, 300 high school students? That's a much more reasonable number of high school students to look at and to ask them these questions I want to talk about, maybe want to find their average height or things along those lines. And we can't talk to the hundreds of thousands or millions or however many high school students there are. There's tons out there, but I can talk to a few hundred. Now, this is the main idea between a population and a sample. But in order to be a good sample needs to be sampled in a way that everybody from the population has a proportional probability of being picked. So that, for instance, if 10% of all high school people are 16-year-old white males, then when I sample, I expect to have a 10% chance of choosing any of those. So we don't want to just maybe go to one particular high school and say, let's just sample everybody here. Because demographically, they might not be the same as everybody in the whole population. So we want to somehow come up with a way to do a simple random sample so that everybody has an equal chance of being picked. So that's what's going on when we're taking a sample. And then if we can get a good representative sample, then what we find out about that sample could probably be a good estimate of the population. It might not be exact for the population, but it gives us a good idea of what the whole population is behaving like. Now, there's a lot of definitions that are going to get thrown around the textbook. I want you to read through carefully all the different definitions of good sampling, bad sampling, and all the different biases that come up. But there's one in particular I want to take a moment to talk about, and that's the difference between a voluntary response bias and non-response. So, when it comes to the voluntary response, this is a sampling technique. It's not the best sampling technique in the world, but the idea of the voluntary response sample bias is when you just ask people, hey, you want to be part of this? So for instance, a survey that's done over the radio where they just say, hey, call in and tell us what you think about that song. This would be a voluntary response sample where people are only going to call in if they want to. Another example of a voluntary response sample is the website ratemyprofessor.com. This sampling technique that they use is not the best. It is just, hey, if you want to come to our site and rate a professor, go ahead. Well, what's going to happen with that kind of sampling? You're only going to get people that are really passionate one way or another, that they either really liked their professor or really hated them. You're not going to get a lot of the in-betweens. There's not a lot of people that thought, the professor is okay. Let me go write a review about him. But if someone really was passionately into their course and the students really loved that instructor, they're like, you know what? That instructor deserves props. I'm going to go review them. And then, of course, there's the opposite end that, oh my God, that professor sucked so bad. I hated him. Let me go write a bad review. So voluntary response sample is not a good sampling technique because you're not getting an equal proportion, or a proportion, I shouldn't say equal, but you shouldn't get proportional values of people that are really passionate, people that are so-so, and people that are passionate in the other direction. So voluntary response samples in general are not going to get you the best idea of what's going on in the population. It's only going to get you the people that really care one way or another about a particular topic, because they're the ones that are going out of their way to make sure that their voices are heard. Now, non-response, on the other hand, is something completely different. Non-response is on a question-by-question basis. What non-response is when you have a sample already, and whether this sample came from a simple random sample, a random sample, from a voluntary response sample, from some sort of stratified sample, whatever sampling technique was used, somebody might choose not to answer something. So that, for instance, if we were talking about weight, and instead of actually weighing someone, you were asking them to fill in their weight, and someone was really self-conscious about their weight, then maybe they don't answer that question on the survey. In that case, that's what we call non-response. And typically what we do with non-response is we just ignore that response. We don't treat it as a yes or as a no, as a certain value. We just ignore it. It doesn't even factor into our sample size then. And so if we had 300 people, but 50 of them didn't answer something, then the sample size that we're going to use for any calculations would only be the 250 remaining, and the others would be non-response. Non-response can be a problem, that if we ask very sensitive questions, then non-response can be a concern. But it's a completely separate concern from a voluntary response bias. The voluntary response sample bias is how you chose the sample in the first place. Non-response is after you've chose the sample, there's a possibility that people aren't answering the questions. So make sure to note the difference between those things.